Mr. Men Road Trip. Little Miss Fun decided it would be fun to go on a road trip. She wanted to drive all her friends all the way across the country, so she bought an RV. Mr. Grumpy grumbled that it was too small. "We will see lots of fun things on the way," announced Little Miss Fun. "Will we go to Hollywood?" asked Little Miss Star. "Yes, that will be our last stop," said Little Miss Fun. "But our first stop is New York." Little Miss Fun and her friends visited the Empire State Building, they visited the Chrysler Building, and they went up the Statue of Liberty. Everything was very tall in New York, but Mr. Dizzy did not have a good head for heights. Mr. Grumpy complained about all the stairs he had to climb. Their next stop was Washington, D.C., where they saw the Washington Monument. Mr. Bump stared up at it. It was so tall. Mr. Bump stepped back to get a better view and fell into the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. Splash! Mr. Grumpy got wet. But the next day, they found the biggest splash in America, Niagara Falls. Little Miss Naughty persuaded Little Miss Lucky to go over the falls in a barrel. "That'll be a barrel of laughs," sneered Mr. Grumpy. "It'll be fun," insisted Little Miss Naughty. Then they went to watch a baseball game. Mr. Strong was very good at batting. He hit the ball way up into the sky, way out of sight. Mr. Grumpy got bored. Little Miss Fun and her friends drove to Mount Rushmore. They were very impressed by the president's faces carved in stone, but not as impressed as when Mr. Impossible carved Little Miss Splendid's face next to George Washington's. "Now that's what I call splendid," exclaimed Little Miss Splendid. "That's what I call a splendid waste of time," griped Mr. Grumpy. And there were many more splendid things to see on their trip. "Look!" cried Little Miss Ditzy the next day. "It's a silver rainbow." But it was not a rainbow. It was the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. It was very wide, even wider than Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arms could reach. Mr. Grumpy did not like being tickled. They went for a ride on a steamboat. Walking up the gangplank, Mr. Bump bumped into Little Miss Fun and knocked her into the river. A little miss in the Mississippi. Mr. Grumpy got seasick. "Shouldn't we be heading west to get to Hollywood?" grumbled Mr. Grumpy the next day. But Little Miss Fun was not driving west. She was driving south. They were headed to New Orleans. Mr. Noisy liked New Orleans. He liked the loud jazz music in the streets. He was the loudest trumpet player in New Orleans. Mr. Grumpy complained about the noise. And Mr. Noisy got the loudest echo in the Grand Canyon. "Hello, hello, 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 hello." The Grand Canyon was the deepest canyon in the country. It was a very long, long way down to the bottom. "Be careful, Mr. Bump," called Little Miss Fun. "Don't get too close to the edge." "It's far too dangerous," moaned Mr. Grumpy, refusing to leave the RV. Little Miss Fun drove to the Rocky Mountains. "Will this trip ever end?" groaned Mr. Grumpy. They found a geyser called Old Faithful in Yellowstone Park. This time, Mr. Bump did get too close. The next day, they drove over the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco. Mr. Greedy was very glad they caught the cable car to the top of the hill. It looked like a very long walk. The view was magnificent, as was the lobster. "I don't like lobster," grumbled Mr. Grumpy. That night, they went camping in Yosemite National Park. The bears were very well behaved, after Little Miss Bossy had told them off. "I wish I had a bed to sleep in," whined Mr. Grumpy. "Cheer up," said Mr. Adventure. "This is quite some adventure." And the adventure continued when they stopped off on the highway and Mr. Cool took them surfing in the Pacific Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean suddenly seemed a very long way away. Mr. Cool was very good at surfing. Mr. Silly had more of a problem. And of course, Mr. Grumpy didn't like getting wet. Little Miss Star was very excited when they finally reached Hollywood. And of course, she became an instant hit. She was not called Little Miss Star for nothing. She even had her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Everybody had a fun trip. Well, not quite everybody. "I'm sorry you didn't have fun," said Little Miss Fun to Mr. Grumpy. "Oh, I had lots of fun," said Mr. Grumpy. "But you complained all the way across the country," cried Little Miss Fun in astonishment. "I'm never happier than when I have something to be grumpy about," said Mr. Grumpy, and grinned, his first grin in 3,000 miles.